Hello, I'm Jim Falk, and thanks so much for watching today's program. A Harris X poll taken earlier this summer found that 69% of Democratic leaning voters wanted someone other than President Biden to head the ticket. The same held true for former President Trump. 62% of those polled said they wanted another candidate. Now, with just over a year to go, the 2024 presidential contest promises to have, no doubt, many twists and turns. And given these high unfavorable ratings, the political organization No Labels has raised the possibility of launching what they describe as a unity ticket, composed of a Republican and Democrat to run against the presumptive major party nominees. However, U.S. history tells us that third parties have not lived up to their hype, stating the case of why the 2024 election might just be the exception. We're joined by David Walker, and he's the co-founder of No Labels. And Mr. Walker served as the U.S. Comptroller General from 1998 to 2008. And giving us the history and background on why, to date, third parties have failed, let me welcome a frequent guest, Professor Jeffery Engel, who is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he's the author or editor of 13 books on American foreign policy and presidential history. Gentlemen, great to see both of you. Thanks so much for joining the program. So I want to start with you, David, and what is the difference right now with this upcoming election that gives you confidence that a unity ticket, a third party, might be successful?
Well, first, No Labels is not a party. We're talking about a third option for president and vice president only if certain conditions exist. We're getting ballot access in all 50 states, and we will provide that ballot access to a potential unity ticket if certain conditions are met. The reason that we believe there's an opportunity this time is severalfold. One, a significant majority of Americans don't want Trump or Biden. Secondly, we're at or near all-time highs for people saying that we're not headed in the right direction, and the future of for our kids and grandkids may not be as good as ours. Thirdly, the number of and percentage of unaffiliated voters has never been higher. It's near 50%, whereas the Democrats have 27% and Republicans have 25%. So with all those different conditions, we think this may be different.
Professor Engel, is this different, and what can we look back from history and see where, as you would say, David, a third option or a third party has not been successful?
I would say I agree with every single one of those conditions. I wouldn't dispute any of that data. Americans are clearly dissatisfied with their current series of options. They're dissatisfied with the people at the top of the potential tickets, and they're dissatisfied with the political system generally. However, I would say as a historian, the history of third parties, forgive me for using that term, let's just use it for colloquial reasons. The history of third parties suggests you got to be careful what you wish for. And almost invariably, the people who run a third candidate against the major party candidates wind up getting the opposite of what they actually desire. They wind up in many ways getting the least likely outcome, at least favorable outcome from their perspective. So while I completely endorse the idea of thinking of ways beyond our two-party conundrum at this point, our two-party malaise, if you will, I would be very cautious to recommend any third party think that they are going to solve the problem that they're trying to solve. They might actually make it worse.
David, I was talking to a colleague a few days ago and mentioned that we were going to be having this discussion, and they said, No Labels is a Trojan horse for Donald Trump. And I believe that a large number of your supporters are Republicans, but you have a pretty strong case of why you would say you're not a Trojan horse.
Well, first, we have supporters of Republicans and Democrats and unaffiliated. I don't know one person, not one person affiliated with No Labels leadership who wants Donald Trump to repeat as president of the United States. At the same point in time, it really doesn't matter what I want. It really doesn't matter what the No Labels leadership wants. What matters is what the American people want. And the truth is, there's less satisfaction with Biden than there is with Trump. But in our case, we don't want either one of them. They're not equal. They're very different people. But the American people have spoken. And America is based on choice and competition. And if the parties do not listen to the American people and do not provide better nominees, the American people will deserve a third choice, and they'll get it. But they'll only get it if we see a pathway to victory in the Electoral College. We saw it in December. That pathway to victory has increased between December and August. And if we see it next April, it'll happen.
All right, so how many states are you on the ballot now?
We're on 11 now. We expect to be on 27 by the end of the year. And as you probably know, Jim, there's a number of states that you can't even get on the ballot until you have actual candidates. And we expect that we will end up naming our candidates at our convention, which is going to be next April 14 and 15 in Dallas, Texas.
Jeff, I know you've given a lot of study on the Perot candidacy in 1992. And one thing that I'd forgotten is that he was leading both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton before he withdrew. Give us your little bit of historical perspective, because did he have a path to victory?
That's a great question. And I think both 1992 and 1912, which I hope we get a chance to discuss, I think are really illustrative here because, frankly, Ross Perot, as you mentioned, was leading in the national polls in the early summer of 1992 when he decided to suddenly pull out. And then, of course, he got back in a little bit later. When he got back in a little bit later, he kind of lost his momentum for the entire national campaign. But the truth of the matter is those were national polls. If you break things down on a state level, it's actually really hard to make a case that Ross Perot was destined to get 270 electoral votes. I will say it probably would have been closer than we possibly could have imagined in any other scenario. But just because Ross Perot was leading in the national polls, because of what David just said about the fact that states give their electoral college votes to the winner, it doesn't mean that he was destined to get the 270. In fact, I think my statistical analysis and most political scientists at this point suggest two things. First, that Ross Perot was actually not going to win the presidency at any time. And now, granted, that's 5 months before the election is when he pulled out. And secondly, that frankly, he went in many ways in order to provide an alternative, a conservative businessman's alternative to George Bush, and wound up in many ways giving the election to Bill Clinton. Much like, and again, I'd like to go into this in detail if you have time, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt said much what my colleague just said, that they have a statistical way of getting to 270 to remove the incumbent, William Howard Taft, as a Republican, and in fact wound up throwing the election to the Democrats. So in each case, I found that, at least in the 20th century, when we have a third party running, a third candidate running, if you will, what they wind up doing is actually thinking they might be able to get to 270, but in essence, they wind up splitting their own natural constituencies and handing the election to the person they least desire.
I'd like to hear what both of you say on this question because, for a long time I thought that Ross Perot's being in the race really took more votes and hurt George H.W. Bush. But a lot of political scientists now believe that that wasn't the case, that he drew perhaps almost equally from both candidates. David, what do you think?
Ross Perot was a friend of mine. And in fact, Ross Perot funded the unprecedented 27-state, 10,000-mile national fiscal responsibility bus tour that I did in 2012. But the fact is, in my opinion, Ross Perot did not want to be president of the United States. And that's one of the reasons that he dropped out. Ross Perot wanted to wake up America, and it wanted to affect the agenda of the next president of the United States and the Congress. And guess what? He did. He got 19% of the vote, but 0 electoral votes. But, as I mentioned before, our polling is state by state. It's based upon the Electoral College. It's not a national poll, all right? And so therefore, we've learned the lessons from the past. So we've got a situation where we believe there are unprecedented conditions that exist. We've learned from the past, and we're prepared to advance to a better future.
Jeff, give me your quick thoughts. Did Ross Perot hurt or help Bill Clinton?
Well, let me answer that after answer in direct response to my colleague. I haven't seen your data, and I would love to, and I'm sure it's very robust. My problem as a historian is I can tell you that in 1912 and in 1992, the people running the third candidate said, I have data that shows me I'm going to win. And obviously didn't happen. So
No,
again,
sure.
data doesn't always, unfortunately, if data worked out better, we'd all do much better at the racetrack than we do. Specific question about 1992, because Jim, you're absolutely right that when we look at poll exit data of people who voted for Bill Clinton or for George Bush, rephrase that, of people who voted for Ross Perot in the November election, more people said their second choice would have been Bill Clinton than George Bush, which you can read in two ways. I think the best way to read it, a sophisticated way to read it, is to say, yes, it's true that George Bush got hurt more in many ways, that Bill Clinton got aided more by Ross Perot. But more importantly, what it really tells us is there's really no path to victory for Bush absent the votes that Perot took from him. So yes, more people wanted Bill Clinton as a second choice. But what Perot really did was to take away the part of the electorate that Bush would have needed in order to squeak out a victory. I mean, there's a lot of things in 92 that were actually favoring Bill Clinton to begin with. So Ross Perot, I think, didn't give the election to Bill Clinton, but he did guarantee the election for Bill Clinton.
Go ahead, David.
We have to keep in mind that the New York Times exit poll on Election Day in 1992 said that that of the people who voted for Ross Perot, that 38% would have voted for Clinton, 38% would have voted for Bush, and 24% wouldn't have voted at all. Anything else is speculation.
So I want to extend on something you said a minute ago, and that is that Ross Perot did not want really to be president. He really built a movement. And Jeff, when you look at some of the third-party candidates, their participation, in fact, evolved and changed the political party system. So give us an example of that, Republicans, Whigs, and so forth. And then I want to go back to David and ask him, is No Labels really trying to get someone elected or perhaps just move the two parties?
Well, and again, this is why I think 1912 is actually really interesting, because we have to go back a little bit. Forgive me for putting the historian cap on fully. I'll go back to the election of 1896, which actually sets a framework of electoral college map, which is absolutely rock solid, going to go Republican no matter what. There basically was an electoral college lock for Republicans that existed basically all the way until something terrible happened to rock the system. Well, two things rock the system. Ultimately, it's the Great Depression that changes things enough. But also, 1912 is the only election that Democrats win, with the exception of 1916, Wilson winning again, within that electoral lock, because Republicans split their vote. So this is a good example where we really don't see that many policy differences between the candidates. I think in many ways, this is a case where historians come back again and again and again to ask the central question, why did Theodore Roosevelt run in 1912, given that his policy differences with Taft weren't all that great, certainly not as great as they were with Woodrow Wilson? And I think the answer comes back, sadly, to ego, that in essence, he couldn't imagine himself not being part of a political system, political elite for the next 4 years. If he had waited 4 years, most historians believe he could have come back and won handily in 1916, having not broken the party. So what he really does is essentially shatter an electoral college system that should have been fully lock solid for the Republicans, again, getting the opposite result of what he really wanted, which is to say he wound up with a Democrat in office rather than either himself or a fellow Republican.
So following up on that, David, I mean, is your motivation of No Labels with the unity ticket to really just put enough pressure on President Biden and former President Trump so one of them might step down?
Let me be clear. Our objective is to be in it to win it, and we're not going to be in it unless we believe we can win it. Data shows, and again, data is not everything, and data can change. Data shows that the public dissatisfaction with regard to the state and direction of the country and the two likely candidates are such that provides a potential path for victory. If one or both of those individuals are not nominated by their respective parties, that path may evaporate. And if that path evaporates, we won't run a third option. But understand this, we also have the common sense agenda, which is on No Labels website, www.nolabels.org, as well as the polling that I've referred to previously. And that includes 30 issues of concern to the American people and a way forward to address those issues. Just as Ross Perot hoped to affect the national agenda, whether he won or not, we hope to affect the national agenda because right now we're at gridlock. Too many wingnuts on the left, too many wingnuts on the right, not enough people representing the sensible center. We have over 70 million people who have confirmed that they are prepared to vote for a third party unity option if things continue as they are right now. Now, whether they will or won't, who knows? All right. But that's where we stand. So we're only going to run it if we think we can win it in the Electoral College, offer our line. We're not a party. And we hope to affect the national discussion and debate. But if the candidates end up picking somebody else, it may be a whole new ballgame.
David, how are you going to pick your candidates? Where's the unity ticket coming from?
Yeah, we're in the process of trying to decide that question. What we generally want is we want broad-based input on people to consider. We then will have a nominating committee that will do significant screening, due diligence, interviews, etc. We obviously want them to be people who we think are capable, credible, unity-oriented people who think very positively about the common sense agenda, which is our policy agenda for America. Not ours, really, it's the American people's. We're just the intermediary. And it's likely to be that there will be one or more individuals recommended to the convention, and the convention will then vote.
Jeff, let's go back and put on your historian cap again, but more recent. Talk to us about the impact that the Green Party had, Jill Stein.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that the Green Party had a dramatic effect, obviously, in changing the course of the election, just as Ralph Nader, I think, had a dramatic effect in changing the course of the 2000 election. Yet again, examples where I think people who run as a third candidate wind up getting, in essence, the president that they least want, even though they want to change the debate. What it really boils down to, for many ways, I think, when we think about third parties, and I need to be clear here, I am fully on board with the overall agenda. I am fully on board with moving past the two-party system. I love the common sense idea of coming together. What worries me is that anytime a third party runs, it's kind of based on the presumption that neither of the other major party candidates are good enough, or more importantly, that they're equally bad. And I think that, frankly, the 2024 election is shaping up between a case of a man who nobody is enthusiastic about, Joe Biden, whether for his age or for his policies, versus a person, frankly, who had a difficult track record following the Constitution when he was president. In fact, I'll go so far as to say he did not try to follow the Constitution when he was president. And of course, the courts are currently adjudicating that. So if we really had a case of saying both candidates are absolutely equally bad, well, then that would give you a sort of a viable theoretical option for finding a third candidate. I don't think that's the case here, much in the same way that I would ask people who voted for the Green Party in earlier elections, say in 2000 for Ralph Nader, if at the end of the day they really look back now and think Al Gore and George Bush were actually the same person, would events have turned out differently, especially on environmental concerns? Would Al Gore and George Bush have done the same thing? And ultimately, I think most Green Party voters for Ralph Nader would tell you that at the end of the day, they loved their conviction, but they think the result was actually the opposite of what they really wanted. So again, for a third party to be functional today, I would just ask people before they consider that vote to say, are you actually equally discomforted with either of the other options? And if you find a difference between the two, that's probably the more safe place to place your bet.
David, let's hear what you have to say.
Well, I think we have to keep in mind that people are concerned with Trump and Biden for very different reasons. They're concerned with, he's got a very strong base of support, zealots, if you will. But I personally don't like his personality at all. I don't like what happened on January 6th at all. We'll see how that plays out in the courts. All right. At the same point in time, There are people that are very concerned that Biden's not who he said he was. He said he was a centrist. He was going to be a unity candidate, but his policies are much further left than he is as an individual. They're very concerned about his health, not only particularly with regard to his acuity, and frankly, they're very concerned about his vice president. I think, if you had a race between Biden, Trump, and Harris, Harris would be a very far distant third. And there's increasingly
David,
number
let me interject because we have just a few minutes. And
yeah.
One question I have about this, and it'll be to both of you. You have not announced, or probably you haven't decided, who's going to be at the head of the ticket, whether it's going to be Republican or Democrat. Can you give me a sense of how you see that?
We see it based upon what do we think is the best ticket in order to win. Okay. I know Democrats would probably be less concerned if we had a Republican at the top of the ticket. On the other hand, Republicans would be less concerned if we had a Democrat at the top of the ticket. Let me just go back to where I started. We need to learn from history. We need to learn from others, but we need to take steps to prepare for a better future. The circumstances that exist today have never existed before. They have never existed before. This is an opportunity that may or may not end up resulting in a third option. And it will only result in a third option if there's a pathway to victory in the Electoral College. We'll see what happens.
Jeff, do you see a difference in the Republican versus Democrat on who's heading the ticket?
Well, I do, but I think more importantly, again, looking at the historical examples, whether it's 1912, 1992, we also should talk about perhaps 1948 with the Dixiecrat candidate. In each case, the only way a third party really gets going, again, forgive me for using party, but a third candidate really gets going, right, is if they themselves have a particular cult of personality. Remember, Ross Perot was famous enough on his own to be a lead star for CNN's Larry King time and time and time again before he ever announced for president. He was a nationally known figure. Obviously, Theodore Roosevelt was a nationally known and nationally popular figure. I don't see personally anyone in the political landscape today who might be on the agenda as a nominee for no labels, who frankly is that individually popular. And God willing, I wish there was one. But there just doesn't seem to me to be an individual who is capable of not only drawing together that dissatisfaction with the two parties, but also getting people enthused about themselves individually in a way that Perot and Theodore Roosevelt, or frankly, George Wallace in '68 did.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point because Ross Perot, in a sense, was high profile, looking for a party, looking for a movement, and here you have, in this case, you have no labels who still hasn't identified, or at least hasn't publicly identified, what their ticket might be.
You also have to keep in mind that in the examples that were given before with regard to Jill Stein and with regard to Ralph Nader, they were clearly on the left. They didn't represent unity candidates at all. All right. Yeah. And so it's not surprising that they tilted the election one way. There's no question about that. This is fundamentally different. And even in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, he didn't have a unity ticket. And by the way, guess who came in third place in 1912? The sitting president of the United States came in third place.
So I want to give you, David, a chance to respond to another criticism of no labels, and that is that you've not disclosed who your backers are and who your donors are. You're a 501c4, is that correct?
We're 501c4. We're not required to disclose our donors. By the way, the people who complain about us, like the Lincoln Project and the Third Way, et cetera, they don't disclose their donors either, okay? Our individual donors are not corporations. They're not lobbyists. They're a cross-section of people with different political affiliations. I myself am an independent, as you know, close to 50% of registered voters are now. Many of our supporters are. And the reason that we don't disclose it is not just because we're not required, but because they will be subject to attack. The parties do not want us to run a third option. You would be shocked and disappointed with some of the personal attacks that take place right now among staunch partisans from people who are involved in the no labels effort. And the only reason they want to know who's contributing is so they can do the same to them.
Well, I know you're getting a lot of attention because all you have to do is look at any newspaper or cable news online and you see criticism of no labels, so you are getting attention. Jeff, I'll give you the last word.
I just again want to commend you, sir, and the No Labels movement for your patriotism, for your service. I fully embrace the idea that we need to rethink the way we elect our presidents and the way our parties are broken down. I don't think this is the election cycle to do that. I think if you want to start working on a party, sign me up. And like the Republican Party in the 1850s, it'll take us several cycles and we'll get the change we want. I think voting right now for a third party is basically throwing your vote towards, frankly, one candidate perhaps who is not interested in democracy.
And on that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you both for spending time with us. Really appreciate your conversation today. The word unprecedented is undoubtedly overused, but the 2024 election deserves this description. According to a CNN poll taken in 2012, 3% of those surveyed strongly disliked both candidates. You remember they were Romney and Obama. Today, 36% of respondents say they strongly dislike the presumptive contenders, Biden and Trump. Now, a majority of voters in swing states have said that they're open to considering a moderate independent ticket. No Label describes their effort as an insurance policy to be only launched if Biden and Trump are the nominees. History tells us, as we've heard, that third parties face too many obstacles to win, although they are often influential. Two things are certain. The ride to November 7th, 2024 is going to be a roller coaster, and Perspectives Matter will be here talking about things that matter with people who care. I'll see you next time.